She drank it slowly, they said, savoured it like wine, the water that had filled young Timothy's lungs, that had stolen his last breath, that had carried away whatever innocence remained in that God-forsaken house. But the barrel wasn't the beginning of the story, and Miss Adelaide Sinclair wasn't the monster they made her out to be, at least not at first. The year was 1848. And Florida was still more wilderness than civilization, a territory where Spanish moss hung like widow's veils, and the swampland stretched endlessly under a sun that seemed to burn away more than just the morning mist. The Whitmore plantation sat on a rise overlooking the Suwannee River, its white columns gleaming like bones against the green darkness of the cypress groves that surrounded it. Marcus Whitmore had sent to Charleston for a governess, demanding only the finest education for his son Timothy, a boy of 8 years who had never known his mother and had learned to fear his father's voice more than the alligators that lurked in the river below. The advertisement had been specific: refined woman of good breeding, required for the instruction of a young gentleman, discretion essential, previous experience with difficult children preferred. Adelaide Sinclair arrived on a paddle-wheeler that churned up the muddy Suwannee like a floating palace, her trunks filled with books and her head filled with ideals about the transformative power of education. She was 26 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, with auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire and green eyes that suggested depths of intelligence that made lesser minds uncomfortable. She had taught at finishing schools in Virginia and tutored the children of senators in Washington, but financial circumstances beyond her control had forced her to accept this position in what she privately considered the wilderness. Her previous employer's bankruptcy had left her without references or resources, and Marcus Whitmore's offer of substantial compensation had been impossible to refuse, despite the isolation it entailed. The plantation house impressed her immediately, a testament to prosperity carved from the harsh Florida landscape. 2 stories of pristine white wood and gleaming windows, surrounded by gardens that bloomed impossibly lush in the humid air. Spanish moss draped the live oaks like nature's own curtains, and peacocks strutted across lawns that seemed too perfect for such an untamed place. But it was the child who captured her attention, and, if she were honest with herself, her concern. Timothy Whitmore was small for his age, with pale hair that seemed almost white in the Florida sun, and eyes the color of winter sky. He spoke little, moved quietly through the house like a ghost, afraid of disturbing the living, and flinched whenever his father's voice echoed through the corridors. Marcus Whitmore was a man who commanded respect through fear rather than affection, a plantation owner who had carved his fortune from swampland and slave labor with equal ruthlessness. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by premature gray and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of profit and loss. His wife had died in childbirth, he explained to Adelaide on her first evening, leaving him to raise Timothy alone while managing a plantation that demanded constant attention. "The boy needs discipline," Marcus said as they sat on the wide veranda, drinking bourbon while the sun set over the river. "His previous governesses have been too soft, too willing to indulge his peculiarities. I require someone who understands that education without character building is worthless." Adelaide watched Timothy through the parlor window, where the boy sat reading alone, his small figure dwarfed by the leather armchair. "What sort of peculiarities?" she asked. "He claims to see things that aren't there, speaks to people who don't exist. His last governess filled his head with nonsense about spirits and such foolishness. I need someone who will teach him to distinguish between reality and imagination." The first weeks passed quietly enough. Adelaide established routines for Timothy's education, introducing him to literature and mathematics, geography and natural sciences. The boy was remarkably intelligent, absorbing information with an eagerness that suggested a mind starved for intellectual nourishment. But there were other aspects of his behavior that troubled her. He spoke frequently of his mother, describing conversations with her as if she were present in the room. He claimed she visited him at night, sitting beside his bed and singing lullabies in a voice like wind through Spanish moss. When Adelaide gently suggested that these were dreams or products of his imagination, Timothy would fix her with those winter-pale eyes and insist that his mother was as real as anyone. More disturbing were his interactions with the plantation's slaves. Timothy seemed to understand things about their lives that no 8-year-old child should know, speaking of their sorrows and fears with an insight that made Adelaide uncomfortable. When she asked him how he knew such things, he would only say that they told him, though she never saw him speaking with any of the field hands. It was during her 3rd week at the plantation that Adelaide first noticed the barrel. It sat in the center of the kitchen garden, a massive oak cask that seemed out of place among the neat rows of herbs and vegetables. When she asked Mattie, the house cook, about its purpose, the elderly slave woman's face went carefully blank. "That barrel been there since before Master Timothy was born," Mattie said, not meeting Adelaide's eyes. "Mrs. had it brought from Carolina, said it was for collecting rainwater for her garden, but it ain't been used for that purpose in years." Adelaide examined the barrel more closely, noting that it was indeed filled with water, clear and still, as glass despite having no apparent source. The staves were bound with iron hoops that showed no rust, despite the humid climate, and carved into the wood were symbols that looked vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen them before. That evening, she mentioned the barrel to Marcus during dinner. He paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, his face darkening with an expression she'd learned to recognize as dangerous. "My wife had many peculiar interests," he said finally. "That barrel was one of her projects, something about collecting water for her plants. I've left it alone out of respect for her memory, but Timothy had a different story. During one of their afternoon lessons, he casually mentioned that his mother used the barrel to watch over the plantation, that the water showed her things that happened far away, things that would happen in the future." Adelaide dismissed this as childish fancy, but something about the boy's matter-of-fact tone made her uneasy. It was on a Thursday evening in October that everything changed. Adelaide had been at the plantation for nearly 2 months, and she'd begun to feel a sense of routine, even comfort, in her isolated life. Timothy was progressing remarkably in his studies, and she'd started to hope that her influence might help heal whatever wounds had been inflicted by his father's harsh discipline. She was returning from an evening walk along the river when she heard shouting from the main house. Marcus's voice, raised in fury, followed by the sound of something breaking. When she reached the front porch, she could hear Timothy crying, a sound that cut through her heart like broken glass. She found them in the parlor. Marcus standing over his son with a leather strap in his hand, the boy cowering on the floor beside an overturned table. Books lay scattered across the Persian rug, their pages torn and covers bent. Timothy's shirt was ripped, and Adelaide could see red welts rising on his pale arms. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, stepping between father and son, "please control yourself." Marcus turned those calculating eyes on her, and she saw something in them that made her blood run cold. "He's been telling lies again," he said, claiming his mother spoke to him, filling his head with nonsense about spirits and prophecy. "I will not have it in my house. He's only a child," Adelaide protested, "a lonely child trying to cope with his mother's death. Surely patience and understanding would serve better than violence." "Understanding?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You don't understand anything about this family, Miss Sinclair, about what my wife was, what she did to this house, to this boy. She filled his head with poison before she died, and I'll beat it out of him if necessary." Adelaide helped Timothy to his feet, noting the way the boy trembled against her side. "The child needs rest and medical attention," she said firmly. "Whatever discipline you feel is necessary can wait until tomorrow." That night, as she tended to Timothy's wounds in his bedroom, the boy told her things that made her question everything she thought she understood about the Whitmore family. His mother, he claimed, had been more than just eccentric. She'd been gifted with sight, able to see things others couldn't, able to speak with spirits that lingered in places of great sorrow. "The plantation had been built on cursed ground," Timothy whispered as Adelaide applied salve to his cuts. "Built over an old cemetery. an Indian burial ground that Daddy bought cheap because nobody else would touch it. Mama said the spirits were angry, that they demanded payment for the desecration of their resting place. Adelaide tried to dismiss this as childish imagination, but Timothy's next words stopped her cold. "That's why she filled the barrel with water from the sacred spring," he said, "to give the spirits a window, a way to watch over their stolen land." But Daddy didn't understand. He thought she was practicing witchcraft, trying to curse his business dealings. He fought with her about it every night, screaming that she was bringing evil into his house. The boy's winter-pale eyes met hers in the lamplight, and Adelaide saw something there that children shouldn't possess. Knowledge, ancient, terrible knowledge that seemed to burn in his young face like fever. "The night I was born, Mama saw her own death in the barrel's water, saw herself bleeding out on the birthing bed while Daddy stood over her, not with sorrow but with relief. She knew he was glad to be rid of her and her spirits and her inconvenient truths." Adelaide felt something cold settle in her chest. "Timothy, those are terrible things to say about your father. Surely you don't really believe that he wanted your mother to die." But Timothy just smiled, an expression far too knowing for his 8 years. He didn't want her to die, Miss Adelaide, but he was glad when it happened. Glad to have the house to himself, glad to be free of her warnings and her prophecies. He thought burying her would bury the truth about what he'd built this plantation on. Over the following days, Adelaide found herself drawn repeatedly to the barrel in the kitchen garden. She told herself it was mere curiosity, an attempt to understand the source of Timothy's obsession with his dead mother. But if she were honest, there was something about the still water that compelled her attention, something that whispered of secrets waiting to be revealed. She began visiting the barrel in the early morning hours, when the mist still clung to the river and the plantation slept under Spanish moss and silence. The water was always perfectly clear, perfectly still, like glass poured into the wooden frame. But sometimes, when the light caught it just right, Adelaide thought she could see shapes moving in its depths. At first, she dismissed these as reflections, tricks of light and shadow that created the illusion of movement. But gradually, she began to recognize patterns in the shapes, glimpses of scenes that seemed to play out like memories captured in liquid amber. She saw a woman with Timothy's pale hair and winter eyes, kneeling beside the barrel with her hands pressed to its rim. She saw Marcus, younger and less grey, standing in the doorway with an expression of disgust and fear. And she saw Timothy, not as the 8-year-old boy she knew, but as an infant, crying in his cradle while his mother lay dying just rooms away, his father standing over the deathbed with dry eyes and clenched fists. The visions, if that's what they were, became more frequent and more detailed. Adelaide began to understand the source of Timothy's knowledge, the reason he spoke of his mother, as if she was still present. The barrel wasn't just filled with water, it was filled with memory, with the accumulated sorrows and secrets of everyone who had ever looked into its depths. She saw the plantation's true history reflected in those dark waters. The cemetery that had been destroyed to clear the land, the graves that had been dug up and their contents scattered like refuse. The Indian bones mixed with slave bones, both buried in unmarked pits to hide the evidence of Marcus's callous disregard for the sanctity of the dead. And she saw the price that had been paid for that desecration. Crop failures that Marcus blamed on weather, slave deaths that he attributed to disease, accidents that claimed livestock and destroyed equipment with increasing frequency. The plantation prospered financially, but it was built on a foundation of suffering that demanded constant payment in blood and sorrow. Timothy's mother had understood this, had tried to appease the angry spirits through ritual and respect. The barrel had been her attempt to give them a voice, a window through which they could observe the world above their desecrated graves. But Marcus had seen only superstition where she offered wisdom, had dismissed her efforts as the ravings of a woman driven mad by pregnancy and isolation. It was during her 6th week at the plantation that Adelaide witnessed the first direct manifestation of the barrel's power. She had been conducting Timothy's evening lessons when the boy suddenly stiffened, his attention drawn to something beyond the parlor window. When she followed his gaze, She saw a figure standing beside the barrel in the kitchen garden. A woman in white, pale as moonlight, with long hair that moved as if stirred by wind despite the still evening air. The figure stood motionless beside the barrel, her hands pressed to its rim, her face turned toward the house with an expression of infinite sorrow. "Do you see her?" Timothy whispered, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear. Adelaide nodded, unable to trust her voice. The figure in the garden was clearly visible, clearly present, though she cast no shadow and seemed to glow with her own inner light. "That's Mama," Timothy said simply. "She's been waiting for someone who could see her, someone who would understand what needs to be done." The apparition remained for perhaps 5 minutes, long enough for Adelaide to memorize every detail of her appearance. Then she faded like mist in morning sunlight, leaving only the barrel and the growing certainty that Adelaide's presence at the plantation was not the coincidence she'd believed it to be. That night, Timothy told her the rest of the story. How his mother's death had broken more than just a family, how it had shattered the careful balance she'd maintained between the living and the dead. The spirits had grown restless without her guidance, their anger manifesting in increasingly destructive ways. The plantation might appear prosperous, but it was slowly dying, corrupted from within by the unresolved grief of those whose rest had been disturbed. "Someone needs to take Mama's place," Timothy explained with the frightening clarity of a child who'd been forced to understand adult complexities far too early. "Someone needs to tend the barrel, to listen to the spirits, to give them what they need to find peace." Adelaide understood then why she'd been drawn to the plantation, why the previous governesses had all fled or met with mysterious accidents. The barrel, or the intelligence behind it, had been calling for someone with the sensitivity to see beyond the veil between worlds, someone with the courage to face what Marcus Whitmore had tried to bury. But understanding her purpose didn't make it easier to accept. Adelaide was a rational woman, educated and skeptical by nature. The idea that she was expected to become some sort of spiritual intermediary, a bridge between the living and the dead, challenged everything she believed about reality and responsibility. It was Marcus himself who forced her hand. He had grown increasingly suspicious of her influence over Timothy, increasingly hostile to what he saw as her encouragement of the boy's supernatural delusions. The breaking point came on a November evening when he discovered Adelaide and Timothy at the barrel, the boy speaking softly to the water, while his governess listened with obvious attention and respect. "This ends now," Marcus declared, striding into the garden with fury radiating from every line of his body. "I will not have my son corrupted by the same madness that destroyed his mother." He pushed past Adelaide, grabbing Timothy by the arm and dragging the boy away from the barrel. Timothy cried out, not in pain, but in genuine anguish, reaching toward the water as if being separated from a beloved friend. "The spirits need to be heard," the boy pleaded. "Mama said they have to be heard, or terrible things will happen. Your mother was a delusional woman who filled this house with poison," Marcus snarled. "And you, Miss Sinclair," he turned his rage on Adelaide, "have proven yourself unfit to educate my son. You will leave this plantation tomorrow morning." Adelaide felt something cold and determined settle in her chest. She looked at Timothy, saw the despair in his winter-pale eyes, and made a choice that would define the rest of her life. "No," she said quietly, "I won't leave. Not until Timothy is safe." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Safe? From what? From discipline? From reality? You're as mad as my wife was, filled with the same ridiculous notions about spirits and supernatural nonsense." "Safe from you," Adelaide said, and the words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge thrown down between dueling opponents. That night, Marcus came to her room, not to discuss her dismissal or to negotiate terms for her departure, but with intentions that became clear the moment he pushed through her unlocked door. He was drunk, his usual control dissolved in bourbon and rage, and he moved toward her bed with the confidence of a man who believed his power extended to every aspect of life on his plantation. Adelaide had been expecting this, had seen it in the barrel's waters days before. She was ready for him, dressed and alert despite the late hour, a heavy brass candlestick gripped in her hands like a weapon. "Get out," she said, rising from her chair by the window. "Leave this room immediately." Marcus paused, perhaps surprised by her composure, her lack of fear. "You forget yourself, Miss Sinclair. This is my house, and you are merely a servant. You'll do as I say, or face the consequences." "I know what you did to your wife," Adelaide said, and the words stopped him cold. "I know why she really died, not in childbirth as you told everyone, but 3 days later when she threatened to expose the truth about this plantation." Marcus's face went white, then red with rage. "You don't know anything. You're raving, imagining things just like she did. She found out about the graves you destroyed, didn't she? About the cemetery you built this house on top of. She was going to tell the authorities, going to expose the fact that you desecrated sacred ground to save money on land purchase." "That's impossible," Marcus snarled, but Adelaide could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. "She's been dead for 8 years. No one could know what passed between us in private." "The barrel remembers everything," Adelaide said, and watched understanding dawn on his face, like the sunrise of his own damnation. "Your wife's spirit has been waiting all this time for someone who could see the truth, someone who could ensure that justice is finally served." Marcus lunged at her then, his hands reaching for her throat with murderous intent. But Adelaide was ready, had been preparing for this moment ever since the barrel showed her what was coming. The brass candlestick caught him across the temple with a sound like an axe biting wood, dropping him to the floor in a heap of expensive cloth and spilled blood. For a long moment, Adelaide stood over his unconscious form, breathing heavily and considering her options. She could call for help, claim self-defense, hope that the local sheriff would believe her version of events over the word of a respected plantation owner. But she knew the truth was more complicated than any legal proceeding could address, and the barrel had shown her a different path to justice. She dragged Marcus's body through the sleeping house, past Timothy's room where the boy watched from his doorway with those knowing winter eyes, down the stairs and out into the kitchen garden where the barrel waited like a judge prepared to receive evidence. It took all her strength to lift his unconscious weight, to balance him on the barrel's rim, and then push him forward into the dark water. He sank immediately, the water closing over his head without a ripple, as if the barrel were far deeper than its wooden walls suggested. For a moment she could see his face beneath the surface, pale and distorted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Then the water began to change. The clear liquid turned dark, first brown like river mud, then red like spilled wine. Adelaide watched in fascination as the transformation spread through the barrel's contents, turning the sacred water into something else entirely, something that contained Marcus Whitmore's essence, his memories, his guilt and fear and accumulated sins. She found herself lifting the wooden ladle that hung beside the barrel, dipping it into the transformed water, raising it to her lips before conscious thought could intervene. The liquid tasted of copper and sorrow, of secrets and suffering, of all the pain that Marcus had inflicted in his pursuit of prosperity. But beneath that bitterness was something else, understanding, clarity, the accumulated wisdom of every soul whose rest had been disturbed by the plantation's construction. Adelaide drank deeply, feeling the knowledge flow into her like wine into an empty vessel, filling spaces in her mind she hadn't known existed. She understood now why Timothy's mother had spent so many hours beside the barrel, why the previous governesses had all been drawn to this place, despite its isolation and strangeness. The barrel wasn't just a window for the spirits to observe the living world. It was a repository of memory, a place where the past refused to remain buried, where justice could be served in ways that human law could never comprehend. When she had drunk her fill, Adelaide found Timothy waiting beside the kitchen door, no longer the frightened boy she'd been hired to educate, but something older and wiser, touched by the same otherworldly knowledge that now flowed through her veins. "Is it finished?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The beginning is finished," Adelaide replied, understanding flooding through her with each heartbeat. "Now the real work begins. They buried Marcus Whitmore's body in the slave cemetery, in an unmarked grave among those whose labor had built his prosperity. The official story was that he'd ridden out to check the boundary markers, and his horse had returned without him, a tragedy that befell plantation owners with unfortunate regularity in the Florida wilderness. Adelaide, as Timothy's governess and the only other adult in the household, naturally assumed responsibility for managing the plantation until the boy came of age. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The angry spirits that had plagued the plantation for years began to find peace, their grievances acknowledged and their suffering given voice through Adelaide's daily communion with the barrel. Crops grew more abundantly than ever before, but now the prosperity came without the hidden cost of supernatural vengeance. Timothy flourished under Adelaide's guidance, his education expanding to include subjects that no traditional school would have recognized. He learned to interpret the visions in the barrel's waters, to communicate with the restless dead, to maintain the delicate balance between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. By his 12th birthday, he could see further into the future than his mother ever had, and his pale eyes held depths of knowledge that would have terrified his father. The barrel became the center of their lives, the focal point around which all other activities revolved. Each morning, Adelaide would drink from its waters, absorbing the memories and wisdom of those who had passed beyond the veil. Each evening, she would listen to the spirits' concerns and work to address their needs through careful manipulation of the living world. Local authorities occasionally inquired about Marcus Whitmore's disappearance, but their investigations never progressed beyond superficial questioning. The barrel's influence extended far beyond the plantation boundaries, reaching into the minds of sheriffs and judges, ensuring that the truth remained safely buried beneath layers of official indifference and supernatural misdirection. Other families in the region began to notice the Whitmore plantation's remarkable prosperity, the way their crops never failed and their livestock never sickened. Some attributed it to Adelaide's modern agricultural methods, others to the rich soil and favorable climate. But the local slaves knew better, whispering stories about the governess who spoke to spirits and the boy who could see the future in dark water. As the years passed, Timothy grew into a young man of unusual wisdom and unsettling insight. He never married, never left the plantation, but remained devoted to the sacred responsibilities that his mother had begun and Adelaide had continued. Visitors to Whitmore Plantation often commented on the strange atmosphere of the place, the way conversations seemed to echo with unspoken meanings, the way the Spanish moss rustled even when no wind stirred the air. Adelaide aged slowly, her auburn hair gradually silvering, but her green eyes remaining as sharp and knowing as ever. The daily communion with the barrel's waters had changed her in ways that defied natural law, granting her longevity and insight at the cost of normal human relationships. She became a figure of legend in the surrounding countryside, the governess who had tamed the cursed plantation, who had brought peace to land that had known only suffering. But legends, like all stories, eventually come to an end. In 1889, 41 years after her arrival at the plantation, Adelaide Sinclair was found dead beside the barrel that had defined her adult life. Timothy discovered her body at dawn, kneeling beside the wooden cask as if in prayer, her hands pressed to its rim in the same gesture that had characterized his mother decades earlier. The water in the barrel had turned crystal clear once again, purged of the darkness that Marcus Whitmore's dissolution had brought to its depths. But carved into the wooden staves, in letters that seemed to burn with their own inner light, were words that no human hand could have inscribed. The debt is paid, the balance is restored, the guardians may rest. Timothy buried Adelaide in the family cemetery, beside the marker that bore his mother's name, but not her remains. The plantation continued to prosper under his stewardship, though he never again touched the barrel's waters, never again sought to commune with the spirits that his mother and Adelaide had served so faithfully. The barrel stands empty now, its sacred purpose fulfilled, its supernatural thirst finally quenched. Timothy Whitmore died a bachelor in 1903, leaving the plantation to distant cousins, who sold it within a year to developers from Jacksonville. The great house was torn down to make room for a lumber mill, and the ancient cemetery was relocated to make space for railroad tracks. But the barrel survived, salvaged by local residents who recognized its historical significance, if not its true nature. It sits today in the Suwannee County Museum, labeled simply as a 19th century water collection vessel, artifact of a more primitive time when superstition held sway over science. Visitors sometimes comment on the way the empty barrel seems to draw the eye, the way conversations grow quiet when people stand near it for too long. Museum staff have grown accustomed to finding the display case mysteriously filled with clear water, though no one can explain where it comes from or how it appears overnight. Local historians dismiss the stories about Adelaide Sinclair as folklore, claiming that records show she died of natural causes after a long and successful career as an educator. The tales about Marcus Whitmore's disappearance are attributed to the romantic imagination of a region steeped in Gothic tradition, where every old house must have its ghost and every tragedy its supernatural explanation. But sometimes, when the Florida mist rises from the Suwannee River and Spanish moss stirs in windless air, people in the surrounding countryside report strange sightings. A woman in 19th century dress, walking along the riverbank with purposeful stride, a pale boy with winter eyes, standing among the cypress trees as if waiting for someone, and always the sound of water lapping against wooden staves, the echo of ancient thirsts finally satisfied. The debt is paid, as the barrel proclaimed. The balance is restored, but some hungers once awakened never truly die. They simply find new vessels, new guardians, new ways to ensure that justice flows like water through the cracks in reality's foundation. And some stories, no matter how thoroughly buried, always find a way to rise to the surface when the conditions are right for truth to bloom in dark places.